Excellent. We're going to start right on time. I know this is very important, so it's a pleasure to have many of you here. We have a competition policy panel. I am Tommaso Valletti, and it's from Imperial College. It's also an opportunity to introduce the RPN, so the Research Policy Network of CEPR on the topic of competition policy. And the idea behind this Research Policy Network is to have really a pragmatic conversation between researchers in the field and policymakers. Part of this is related also to the fact that some of us had some position as enforcers. I was myself chief competition economist of the EU for 3 years until 2019. As part of a job, coming into the job as an academic, I realized that there is excellent research which is being done, but then this research doesn't get to the attention of the policymakers for one reason or another. So it's important for us to reflect whether our methods are not actionable, perhaps, in the research arena, or if there are bottlenecks that we need to overcome. And part of the purpose of the network is also an understanding that the way we approach competition issues historically from the field of industrial organization has become narrower and narrower over the years, so focusing on some specific issues typically related to static price effects. And instead, the field of competition policy is much more interesting than that. So this is a very exciting period for doing research in competition policy. And in the network, we are trying to widen the discussion with other parts of economics. So, for instance, competition and labor market, competition and privacy. We had a big event a year ago. Now there is a debate, for instance, we're not going to tackle today whether inflation, has it related to corporate greed or not. So, but these are discussions where you have sometimes approaches which are through specific lenses. If you're a monetary economist, you don't think about competition. If you're a competition economist, you don't think about the macro effect. So it's important to try to have a conversation which is really multidisciplinary, because these are first-order effects on our economy. So citizens, they do suffer from higher prices, and whether or not this is due to competition, it's an important question. So today, also to reflect the nature of this discussion between academics and policymakers, we decided to have half of it with some research being presented by some researchers from the network, and at the end we will have two enforcers that have dealt with these issues from the field, from the ground. So I'm going to start with Martin Watzinger, University of Münster, is going to talk about competition and innovation through recent research he's been doing with Monika Schnitzler. Martin.
So thanks, Tommaso. Thanks for having me. I will talk about breakups and innovation, and this is joint work with Monika Schnitzler from LMU. I think it's fair to say that there is a quite lively debate whether we should break up big tech. For example, The Guardian recently opined that the new US antitrust suit against Google might break up Google, and this is a good thing because it's a Standard Oil of our day. Similarly, the New York Times opined that it's time to break up Facebook. In the policy circles, certainly the report of the US Antitrust Subcommittee in 2020 stands out. And after a lengthy analysis, they come to the conclusion that we should consider structural separations or line of business restrictions. And this might be like a fair point, because in theory, breakups might make sense. Suppose there is an upstream monopolist who controls an essential facility, an input to a downstream companies, and the downstream companies rely on the essential facility of the upstream company. If then this upstream company is vertically integrated, then the upstream company has an incentive to exclude other downstream companies from the essential facility to soften the competition of its own subsidiary. In this case, vertical breakups might make sense, might increase welfare. But this is theory. Empirically, we know relatively little about the effects of breakups. And the reason is the breakup of a monopolist in the US is a very rare event. So this is a list the major breakup cases in the US. In the 1910s, there was Standard Oil of John D. Rockefeller. There was a breakup of American Tobacco. Then, 70 years later, in 1984, there was the breakup of the Bell system of AT&T. And then in 2000s, the last big case, the court ordered the breakup of Microsoft, but as we all know, this breakup was overturned in 2001 in appeals. In this paper, we want to answer the questions. What are the effects of breakups on innovation? Innovation, besides prices, is a key determinant of welfare, so we think that this is an important question to ask. We focus on two of the cases I just mentioned. We first focus on the effect of the breakup of Standard Oil. Standard Oil was the monopolist in the production of oil, and it was vertically integrated from refinery and transportation, and the breakup took away the transportation part and from what was the essential facility for the market of oil, and separated it from the refinery, what is a potentially competitive segment. The second case we're looking at is AT&T. AT&T was the monopolist in telecommunications, and the breakup separated the local telephone services, what was the essential facility, from the potentially competitive sector of the production of telecom equipment. To see if these breakups changed innovation, we compare the number of patents, what is a measure for innovation, in fields where the monopolist was active to similar technologies where the monopolist was not active, so the number of patents in similar technologies before and after the breakup happened. And this gives an indication whether the breakups actually changed innovation. So what happened? First look at the breakup of Standard Oil. The result can be well summarized in the following picture. So here you see on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, the years the patents were granted over time. And in 1909, the case started, and in 1911, the breakup was implemented. On the y-axis, you see the total number of patents in treated technologies related to oil, here in red, and in similar technologies, here in blue. As you can see, from like the beginning of the sample up to the breakup, up to the year of the breakup, these two lines track very well, what looks like there are similar trends. After the breakup, these lines start to diverge, and in treated technologies, in technologies where Standard Oil was active before, we see many more patents, what looks like a positive effect of the breakup of Standard Oil on innovation. Let's look at the second case. The second case is AT&T. Here again, you see a very similar picture, but we now have the filing year of the patents on the y-axis, what is a better measure of the time of invention, but like in Standard Oil, we did not have this due to data limitations. The case started in 1974 and then dragged on up to 1982. Then it was announced that AT&T, the largest company in the US, would be broken up. And this then took 2 years. In 1984, the breakup was actually implemented. On the y-axis, you see the total number of patents in treated and in controlled technologies in red and in blue. But here we standardized the number of patents to the year 1982 because they have different levels, so it's better to see the effects here. Again, we see like the number of patents track each other closely up to the time of the breakup. And then the number of patents in telecommunications technologies where Bell was active start to explode relative to the controlled technologies. This is, again, an indication that breakups helped innovation. So our analysis suggests that exclusionary conduct can harm innovation, and a vertical breakup might help in these cases. But does this mean that for today's tech giants, these breakups are the right tools? And we think it depends. Namely, it depends on 3 questions. The first question is there actually an identifiable essential facility that is used to exclude competitors? This means there should also be a vertical integration. Second, is the essential facility stable in the sense that it's not eroded by competition over time, because these breakups take 10 years to implement. So that must, like, if competition erodes it by then it's no use to break up companies. And third, are there actually competitors eager and waiting to enter the market? So are there other companies able to do the same thing as the integrated company of the monopolist? And if the answer to all these three questions is yes, then we should think about if breakups are not a tool that we can use in today's environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. This is very interesting. Any question from the audience? Prepare. I'll start. Since you have those three questions, and we have to think about the breakups of the big tech giants. So I don't know what's your views, but I would say number one, Google is an essential facility. Yes, can be used to exclude competitors. There's so many antitrust cases where this has indeed been already analyzed. Essential facilities, it's stable. Well, they've been dominant for 15 years. Number three, competitors just waiting to enter the market. What would you say about that? So it's
for Google, like
for this. So in particular, Google and Facebook, which are the two platforms that we know. But by the way, the breakups of those companies are also trying to undo something that the regulators allowed via mergers and acquisitions in the past. It's not undoing just size as such, but just that this growth came by buying, in the case of Google, hundreds of companies, in the case of Facebook, hundreds of companies that went totally unchallenged for the past 20 years.
So, like, in my opinion, if you look at the search engine market, there are a couple of companies who could enter. In theory, like Microsoft could extend their like one-digit market share in Bing. And there are, of course, Chinese companies, mostly in all of these fields. The big question, like from a US perspective, would be like, are we feeling comfortable that you have a lot of Chinese companies entering? And this was actually the case in 1984 after the breakup of Bell. A lot of Japanese companies entered the market, and these foreign competitors, like at the time, were like brought a lot of innovation. But it's not clear that it's politically feasible. But I would like, it depends on, of course, on the market. But I think there should be competitors ready to stand by. I'm not so sure about the stability of the essential facility, but this is, but one can discuss that.
And in terms of the results that you find, so those breakups, those historical breakups, Standard Oil, AT&T, do you see the increase in patents coming from the companies that resulted from the breakup, or was it entry? So is it just that as you separate into constituents, the further mother bell, whatever, into the baby bells, and then each baby bell starts innovating more? Or do you actually observe actual innovation done by entrants that couldn't enter before?
So this is all other companies. These are not including the Bell companies, and this is not including the follow-on companies of Standard Oil, like ExxonMobil is not included here. If you look at what happened to the following companies, this is much worse identified, but you actually see that innovation goes down a bit. Like if you combine all the baby bells and if you combine the remainder of AT&T and the Bell Labs, and it's the same in Standard Oil. Like it comes from other companies that were not part of the big monopolist at the time. There's a big impact of foreigners, but here you just saw American inventors. So we like. And the papers have many sections, and we also talk extensively about foreign entry, what is a bit difficult to interpret, but yes, these are other companies entering.
So very interesting historical examples where actually we can learn it is possible to unscramble the eggs, but why then the current policymakers in Europe in particular, but maybe this is not a question for you, but more for Benoit and Rod later on, are so reluctant to entertain the idea of structural breakups? In the US it's different. There's currently bills in front of the US Congress where breaking up companies is at least a policy option. But instead, if I think of Commissioner Vestager in Europe, they say, no, we'll never go there, or maybe if they are really bad 10 years from now down the line, we may do something. But it's almost an anathema. So it's been done with success, it seems. Why when it comes to the current debate, it's something we don't even want to talk about?
So I maybe also the enforcer, but like one thing I want to add, like Bell was also regulated like 70 years before the breakup, and like they tried to regulate it, and then after 70 years and 3 antitrust cases, they said they understood that it didn't succeed, and then they entertained the breakup. So you have to redo like history here, I think. We regulate, we will find out it does not work, and then we will in the end.
Great. But what I like from the research of Martin and Monica is that something that to an audience of economists may sound reasonable, that competition drives innovation. That's essentially what you find, and instead monopolies sometimes are not very keen on innovating. This is a discussion that if you talk instead to competition policy circles, they say, no, innovation, there is this ambiguous relationship, the inverted U, we don't know enough, let's leave it. And instead this inverted U comes from comparing very competitive industries and not monopolies. So breaking up a monopoly, if you believe in the inverted U, you're really in the bit of the increasing curve, in the increasing bit of the curve. So
I think that's really interesting, and I think I would concur with the conclusions. But your definition of innovation is rather narrow. It's the number of patents. And I guess that if you would have that discussion with big platform, they would say, well, that's also about diversity of services, the quality of services, customer experience, and so on. And so, I mean, have you thought about it, and would that change your results? Of course, presumably not in the historical case, but maybe in the current case.
So in the historical case, the problem is you do there are no other consistent innovation measures back in time. So I have to speculate. But what we find is that the diversity of patenting actually goes up. Like people try different stuff in the market compared to the monopolists. What would be a similar argument? Like we also look at the Microsoft case, that did not happen. And here we also tried to find some measure of diversity, but this is not so easy.
Next speaker is Réguant. She's Barcelona, Northwestern, and CEPR, and she's going to talk about electricity markets.
Yes, great. So I missed a little bit my assignment. So I will talk about some of my papers, but I will not present the paper. So this will be more of a bigger picture policy discussion. I work on the electricity sector, and as you know, we've been busy, but maybe not most busy with competition policy. So I wanted to think about the current electricity crisis and to which extent do we think there is a role for competition policy? Early on in the crisis, and I'm not talking about January, I'm talking about July and August of last year, when prices started increasing. In the public media, there was a lot of speculation of are the firms increasing prices just for the sake of it. If we look at what was happening, it's just that the market price of the electricity sector was tracking one-to-one, basically. I didn't run a regression. I call this a regression. So the market price in the electricity sector was tracking one-to-one the marginal cost of producing electricity. As you may know, this is basically the cost of natural gas plus the CO2 cost of burning that natural gas. So if we look at this from an IO kind of competition policy perspective, the pass-through kind of looks like one. Again, I didn't run a regression. And it seems like it's not showing that the markups are increasing or anything. It's just that the underlying input costs are rising extremely. The public media, I think, now understands that the crisis is driven primarily by a huge increase in the cost of input prices, which does raise some competition concerns, but more at the geopolitical level, the lack of diversification in where these sources are coming from, but maybe not as much at what individual countries might be able to do. That said, I do think it's worth asking to which extent is the market design contributing to these high prices that we are seeing. And there have indeed been many discussions on whether the market design is kind of failing, whether this electricity price reflecting the cost of natural gas is kind of misleading the costs of manufacturers for electricity, for example, because in reality, natural gas is only 20%, 30%, in some countries even just 10% of what is actually generated, and yet it sets the price for all technologies. So there's been quite a bit of a debate, but not so much about is the market competitive, but rather is the market design adequate in the presence of this very high natural gas prices. There's also been a lot of discussions of how much windfall profit some of these companies have been making via these very, very high natural gas prices, and there's been some discussion on whether that's fair, not fair, whether it should be more equitably redistributed across companies and across households. The windfall profit aspect I will mention later. I do think it interacts with competition quite a bit, and I will be more specific about why. Now, if we look about policy discussions, as I said, competition policy has not been at the forefront of what governments have been trying to do. They've been trying to just put out the fire by cutting taxes, giving subsidies, basically trying to make sure consumers are not too aware of how much electricity prices have been rising. So many of these initiatives have been kind of emergency initiatives that do not affect market design or market structure. There's been some discussions and some attempts at clawing back some of these windfall profit by the large companies. Again, not necessarily successful attempts. And then there has been some discussions on whether we should change the market design, but not really big implementation changes, as well as whether we should be introducing price caps. And Spain, for example, not very successfully, has introduced one. So these are some of the things that are going on in policy. So there's lots going on in policy, again, maybe not as focused on competition. So I wanted to bring it to the competition level and try to ask ourselves to which extent does this crisis interact with the underlying competition issues that we might have been traditionally worried about in this sector. And in the supply side, I do think we see a lot how vertically integrated companies that tend to be the ones with the largest market share, the ones that had been incumbent in the previous regulated past of these markets, have been able to much more easily absorb the shock. These companies also tend to be much more technologically diversified, and they do have assets in technologies that are nowadays not available for competitors, like nuclear power or hydropower. So they do have this comparative advantage, and what we have been seeing during the crisis is that some companies are really struggling to not go bankrupt, given the lack of diversification, a diversification that, again, is not available in the market. You cannot just build a nuclear power plant. I am willing to bet that in Europe you cannot build a nuclear power plant, even if you had $1 trillion. So that does set a disadvantage to typically new entrants compared to incumbents, and it reinforces a little bit some of the previous dynamics of markets with 3 to 4 competitors very big. The very high natural prices also make the stakes of exercising market power higher. So the incentives to exercise market power are now very yummy, and we do see some of these dynamics. I'll talk about it later. In the renewable sector, traditionally renewable power is happy to produce as long as renewable power is available. But if you cut renewables a little bit and the price goes to 30, maybe it's, well, I might cut it. But if you cut renewables a little bit and the price goes to 300, 10 times more, the incentive to exercise market power has been growing, and this is maybe a place where to think about how can we basically at least take advantage of some hours of lots of renewables so that prices, at least in some hours, in some days, they go very low. Something that we are not seeing much, even in very highly renewable heavy markets, such as the electricity market in Spain, which is the one that I have studied the most. I'll show you some of the data later. On the demand side, this is related to the first point, but the vertically integrated firms also participate on the demand side. They have the largest market shares. I'll show you again data for Spain from one of my papers. And gradually over the 10 years that the market has been liberalized, there had been very, very modest entry of new competitors. Some of them had been exploiting smart meters to come up with innovative pricing schemes and try to attract customers that way. They had been carving out very limited market share from the big guys, and now they are all going bankrupt due to the lack of vertical integration and the lack of proper diversification in the presence of these massive shocks. I'm exaggerating, they are not all going bankrupt, but we see pretty healthy competitors that are actually going bankrupt, or some of them, they are not going bankrupt, but they are literally not accepting new customers. They cannot afford to gain market share given the very volatile market conditions. There might be some concerns about this vertical integration facilitating the shakeout via strategic pricing. So what we see is that the incumbents are vertically integrated. They have much more margin to adjust prices up or down, and they are really outcompeting the new entrants that have to price at the margin, and the margin, as I showed you, is a very high price. So let me show you a little bit more of this with my research. So here was just talking a bit more about this market design that has been under discussion. If you ask me, I think high electricity prices are good, by the way, as a signal, but it's true that they have many consequences. So to me, it's not as much about not making the price be the right price, which is a very high price, but rather trying to think how to handle the consequences. It is true, however, as a fact, that average cost is much, much lower than the marginal cost these days in the electricity market, and that some companies with the more traditional technologies like nuclear and hydro have access to these very cheap technologies that are not available for new entry. So this creates, again, a challenge when it comes to competition. It does create a difference that the market cannot really work on. And it does potentially expose some customers to very high prices. So some things that we might be thinking about and that are being under discussion is how to make the market for bilateral contracts more transparent so that manufacturers or even customers can get access to contracts that are closer to average cost maybe than marginal cost, even if the market continues to have these very, very high prices. As I mentioned, there are also some discussions of taking these windfall profits, and a big discussion is if you take the windfall profits away, who should get them? And that's obviously kind of a Pandora box. When it comes to competition on the retail market, I was mentioning this vertical structure has put a lot of pressure on already dwindling retail market that had very weak competition. So here you can see the HHI of the market when it started liberalizing in Spain. And by construction, it should be almost 10,000, okay? Because here, when it started liberalizing, everything was part of the main distributor, except for small territories that here get counted as competition. But you can see that over the many years that the market has been liberalized, 10 in particular, HHI has gone down only to something like 6,500%. This means that in many markets, the incumbent firm that was the regulated incumbent in 2011 still has a market share of 70 to 80% in these markets. It's not literally the regulated firm that has that market share. In particular, it's the regulated and the commercial version of that firm that have the largest market share. If I treat the commercial and the regulated firm as separate, obviously HHI goes down, but it's still highly concentrated markets on the retail side, on customers' preferences. So we have this short paper where we estimate how much of this is driven by switching costs, by inattention, and obviously these are markets with lots of frictions. We also show that in recent years, as I mentioned, the new entrants had been pricing with smart meters in more innovative ways to try to gain market share, some of them with quite a bit of success, gaining maybe 1 or 2% of market share, which in these markets is kind of a lot given the lack of active participation, active competition. But as I mentioned with the crisis, all those small gains in competition seem to be going away. Vertically integrated companies, to be fair, at the moment are offering the best deals, so they are gaining back many, many customers that they had lost during this crisis. So my final point is on the renewable side of things. So this is the distribution of electricity prices in the Spanish market during spring. Spring is a bountiful season when it comes to electricity because demand is low and renewables are high. So it's kind of the season when you expect prices to go low. And we do indeed see some small instances in which prices have been zero. But to the most part, the price has been set by the cost of natural gas, even in moments in which renewables are producing 60%, 70% of the market share. So one thing that requires further investigation and that I will not have here is what are the incentives and the ability for firms to avoid zero prices. And again, I am speculating here, but it would be worth it to understand to which extent can firms withhold some of the renewable output to make sure that the price is 150 to 100 to 150. Again, before that incentive was already there, but it was not very big. The price was 30, 35, 40. Now the incentive is really big. So it would make sense, honestly, if you are a renewable producer to take out a little bit and make sure that the price doesn't go to zero. Here, I think it's important to consider when it comes to renewable, and this might be useful for competition policy, the difference between physical ownership and strategic ownership. So if we look at the physical ownership of renewables, it's kind of the dream for someone who dreams about competition. Yes, the big producers continue to have large market shares, but on top of that, there's a myriad of producers that are pretty small, that are bringing in their installations, that are building solar power. That's physical ownership. It's quite fragmented, again, setting aside that half of the market is still in the hands of the big guys. But these small producers, they are not active participants in the market. So the way that they will develop their operations is that they get a power purchasing agreement on a fixed contract, and then they delegate bidding to somebody else. So this data is slightly outdated. I believe it's from the mid-2010s. In electricity, mid-2010s, it's really outdated, okay? So 2015, I think. So we have data here on the market share of renewable power, again, a little bit outdated. The ones in orange are the incumbents, and you can see that they do participate heavily in these markets. They benefit from the diversification that renewables bring, and they have a lot of expertise and ability to develop. We also have lots of small producers. This is physical ownership, but they get bundled up into these renewable clusters. These renewable clusters might not be building the installations themselves, so technically they might not be the owners, but they are the ones in charge of doing the bidding. So when we think about that, the market is not super concentrated, but it's really not super competitive either. So that's kind of one angle to consider going forward. In the paper, which is work in progress with Ryan Kellogg, we also show that some market design features incentivize this strategic ownership. So there are quirky details on how bidding works in the market that create nonlinearities in the bidding rules that make large firms more competitive by design. So then it's not only that a small solar panel is risk averse and doesn't have the incentives to participate in the bidding auction, it's really that by being small, it's being hurt by design, by the market rules. So these are tiny details from these very complex markets to keep an eye on. It's kind of part of that paper, but again, I kept it at a very high level for the presentation.
That was great. Thank you very much, Mar. Also interesting to see what are the limits to competition in such a complex market like electricity. And although I still find it difficult to explain to the lay person how come that we are switching more and more into renewables with low marginal costs and they don't see any effects. They only see prices going up further and further. So explaining society what's happening there, it's one of the tasks that it's upon us to explain a little bit what's going on, which is not the easiest one. No?
Yeah, no, and one challenge is that people see these two things happening at the same time. So it's definitely, they have definitely tried to spin it as the high prices are because of renewables, and I'm like, okay, wait a minute, it's the natural gas price. But yeah, there is a lot of confusion among the public. These are things that we need to work on. With a healthy retail market, you could see retailers competing for customers by giving them part of the rents that come from having solar panels. There are some operators, for example, in the Spanish market that are doing that. They allow customers to participate in renewable investments so that they benefit from the average cost of renewable power, not the marginal cost of electricity. But again, it's not a highly competitive market, so it takes quite a bit of time given switching costs, inattention, and frictions.
Thanks. Thank you, Mar, very much. I need to enforce the time, unfortunately, and we have two policymakers now. To my left, I'll start with Rod Sims. Rod Sims was until recently the head of the ACCC, which is the Competition Authority and Consumer Protection Regulator in Australia, and we're also delighted to have Rod as the chairman of the CEPR RPN on the competition policy in this attempt to have a dialogue between academics and policymakers. So, Rod.
Thanks, Tommaso. So I'm going to deal with two topics very quickly. Sorry for the speed speaking. One is Tommaso asked me to talk about what agencies need from economists, academic economists, and so I'll address that. And then I'm going to talk just very briefly about Australia's News Media Bargaining Code, which you may or may not have heard of. On the first topic, my view is that antitrust is not in a very good place at the moment. Adam Smith's invisible hand, of course, relies on market forces, but those market forces need sufficient competition. My view, which of course can't be contradicted, is that if Adam Smith came back to the planet, he'd be appalled at the level of concentration in our economy, but you can see that that can't be contradicted. We also have a debate about whether we have, there's a very, very regular debate about whether we have too much market capitalism going on. I think there's a very good argument that we don't have enough, market capitalism, meaning we just don't have enough competition to have the economies working as we would like them to work. I was in a meeting prior to leaving the ACCC with a lot of international antitrust heads. That was one of the benefits when you live in Australia of COVID. You could have a lot more virtual meetings and see your colleagues in ways you otherwise couldn't. And one of my colleagues, who wasn't an economist, but a very prominent agency head, said, and I quote, "If we focus on market concentration, we upset the economists." Now, I found that a very disturbing thing to have said. I worked for 15 years as a commercial strategy advisor in a sort of McKinsey offshoot company, so I know extremely well that there's no doubt in business minds that the more concentrated the market, the higher the prices, the higher the profits. They would think that was an almost one-to-one rule. And I know that economists, by and large, think that. But I'm trying to think, what is the problem here? And of course, I should preface this by saying that agencies benefit enormously from academic work. That brings enormous rigour and helps our thinking a lot. But I think there's sort of two issues with academic work, and I'll be deliberately controversial. One is that to be published, you've got to come up with an unusual insight. And that unusual insight is often, at least to my biased reading, an insight that says, well, in this circumstance, a lack of competition actually enhances efficiency. And so thinking that if you published an article that said more competition is better, that's ho-hum. But if you find those exceptions to the rule, then you're in a better place to get published. The second problem is the models often rely on a lot of assumptions that mean the results of the models don't help in general application. They're too dependent on the assumptions. So the problem all this creates for competition agencies, and of course I'm giving a very biased view here, is that when we're trying to take action, perhaps to prevent a merger or to take action to deal with exclusionary conduct or coordinated conduct, we're faced with a lot of argument that says, well, here's all this research saying this is possible, this is possible. What that does is it raises the evidentiary burden, because in court cases you're trying to deal with a balance of uncertainties, and you can't prove anything completely. Certainly you can't on a merger because it hasn't happened yet. So the more uncertainties in the mix, the more we try and say, well, if it's uncertain, we have to bias against enforcement. I think that's why we have a lot of under-enforcement. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to blame academic economists for all the problems with antitrust. I save that for the lawyers, of course, who I won't offend anybody here by belting up lawyers, but of course they're paid to win cases, and that's their KPI, and they're very good at it. So that's my main problem. So I think we do have a lot of under-enforcement. So to answer Tommaso's question of how academics could help, I think we need broader models which can give us guidance on, in these sort of circumstances, this is what you can expect by taking a broader approach to the study. When can we expect harm in horizontal mergers, vertical mergers, and particularly conglomerate effects? There's a lot of work to be done on conglomerate effects. When are they a problem? Under what circumstances? I saw Martin's three questions that had to be answered. That's extremely helpful so that you know what you're focusing on. Secondly, perhaps working with agencies to do more ex post analysis when either the agencies did or didn't intervene. What was the effect? And I think sometimes agencies have data they can share with academics. And lastly, just what's the effect of rising concentration, or have we got rising concentration in the economy? What's its effect? Because after all, that's the key KPI that agencies are trying to deal with. Their KPI is not winning cases. Their KPI is, have we got more concentration due to anti-competitive behaviour? And we need more research to tell us whether in fact that's the case. I've just moved to the Australian National University, and that's exactly the research I'm going to do. So I actually hope not many of you take up that particular suggestion, so I've got the field to myself. Just on the News Media Bargaining Code, which some may or may not have heard of, but it was a code that applied to Google and Facebook to compensate media content owners for the content they provide the platforms. It gained a bit of notoriety because when the legislation was threatened to be passed, Google said they would move Google search out of Australia. Of course, within about 3 days, the chief executive of Bing was talking to Australia's Prime Minister about how Bing could take Google's place. So that was a wonderful competitive response, Martin, you'll be pleased to hear. And Facebook took all news down, but they also took down health alerts, bushfire alerts, which seriously endangered people's lives. So this was a great game of brinkmanship. But the legislation did pass. Obviously, the business models of Google and Facebook are to provide free services. They get the data from users, they advertise to them, and they make an enormous amount of money. And I mean, it's a really clever business model. One of the problems with the business model is it means, of course, there's no mechanism that the model doesn't work if you want to pay content creators. And so we have, that's particularly a problem when you've got media and journalism. There are definitely positive externalities with media and journalism, and our society needs that more than ever, I would argue, these days. Google and Facebook, we did a lot of work at the ACCC. We've probably done more market study work on the platforms than anyone else in the world. Now, that's a statement that could get contradicted, but we'll see whether Tommaso wants to do that. But we've done a lot of work, and it's quite clear that Google and Facebook have market power in a range of markets. And one of the ways they exercise that market power was not to entertain any discussions with media owners about getting paid for their content. So the legislation that was passed basically required, if designated, if Google and Facebook were designated under the legislation, that they would have to negotiate with media companies, and if those negotiations weren't successful, there would be an arbitrated outcome. Now, what happened was, to avoid designation, Google and Facebook went off and did commercial deals. In the case of Google, with I think every media company that qualifies, large, medium and small. In the case of Facebook, they probably dealt with 80-85% of the media companies, depending how you measure it. So it's been enormously successful. The media companies are very happy with the deals, over $200 million per annum being paid to the media companies, which is not a lot for Google and Facebook, although if that was generalised around the world it would be, but it's made an enormous difference to media. If you talk to a journalist in Australia at the moment, they would argue there's never been a better time to be a journalist. It's much easier to get a job because all the media companies are hiring journalists as a result of the money that they've got. I heard this morning reference to what I term the Tinbergen rule. That's exactly what we followed with the News Media Bargaining Code. It's targeted simply to rebalance the bargaining power. So the ability to go to arbitration rebalances the bargaining power. That's its objective. It didn't have wider objectives about diversifying media sources, a whole range of other things. It had a very narrow objective, and it is being copied potentially in the US, Canada, the UK. My concern is people will broaden its objectives and muck it up. So I think it's a classic example of where the Tinbergen rule is spot on. One instrument to achieve one objective. So 2 topics on speed dial, Tommaso.
Great, Rod, and we will keep hearing from you for much longer, but we've got limited time. But it's humbling for us researchers also to hear that as economists, perhaps it's a better characterization, those of us doing theory work, our 2 hands, we have a set of possibility results, and this possibility results in a world of asymmetric resources, where there is large, powerful companies can be easily hijacked to create doubt in front of regulators that never allow to move the dial. And that's something important for us to remember all the time, creating doubt via our research. But we don't have much time, and I want to hear, so this is an outgoing enforcer. Now we've got Benoit, who's heading the Autorité de la Concurrence for the past 4 months, I understand. So you got an institutional role, so you wouldn't be able to be as open as Rod, I guess. But or maybe you will be. So to tell us about your challenges in your current role.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tommaso. Thank you for having me here. It's great to be back here in Sciences Po. Yes, I've been in the job for 4 months, which I guess is basically a handicap in my daily life. Even though I'm working on it, I can reassure you. But it might be an asset for the current discussion, because I've joined from an area which is highly economics intensive, which is central banking, with all kind of flaws and issues with the way we use economic models in central banking. So that would make for another seminar. But at least I can try to carry over from my previous job, trying to have a principle-based approach and trying to decide based on facts, and that's what I'm trying to do. And so Tommaso also asked me to kind of comment on areas where economists could help enforcers, and I've thought of 3 areas just based on my recent experience. And one of them, basically, by the way, will allow me to come back to the bargaining code and to publishers' rights, because that's a common area of interest between France and Australia. But I wanted to start with ex post assessment, which is also something Rod mentioned, for 3 reasons. First is that we have a pretty well established methodology to assess the consequences of mergers and anti-competitive behavior, which is mostly based on prices. And now many of the markets we are scrutinizing are markets with zero price, basically, free services. So we've got to do it differently. Action is in the quality and in the diversity space, and we basically lack the metrics to make sense out of it, and in legal terms to establish the theory of harm that would work in that kind of markets. And maybe a related issue, which might be more acute in mergers than in antitrust, is about the assessment of efficiency gains. I've been really struck in the mergers I've come to see since I've joined that efficiency gains are hardly being discussed at all. And so there is a kind of chicken and egg issue that, you know, the firms and the lawyers, they come with economists, and they say, and we ask them, so what will be the efficiency gains? And they say, oh, well, we know you're not going to account for them. We know you're not interested, so we didn't look into it. So it's really a kind of a bad equilibrium, really. I think if we had better methodologies and metrics to capture the extent and also the time horizon, which is a big discussion in mergers of efficiency gains, we would make a better job. And maybe the last reason is about moving from micro to macro, which is something that I think also Tommaso alluded to. I mean, if competition authorities want to be part of the public discussion, they need to be able to distill the micro gains of what they're doing and to map them into aggregate numbers. So how much did we lift GDP thanks to enforcement? How much taxpayers' money did we save? And also, very importantly today, what has been the impact on prices, on aggregate prices? And we hardly know anything about that. And so there is all this discussion evolving, and Tommaso said he didn't want to raise it, so I'm not raising it, but still, on greedflation and how much did market power contribute to inflation and so on. And there can be, I mean, there is one dimension which is kind of in the steady state. I mean, how much did the steady increase in market power contribute to increasing the price level? That's something we know actually little about. And then you would have the short-term dimension, which is how much did friction? I mean, how much does anti-competitive behavior contribute to the pass-through in the short term, to the rate of variation? And we also know very little about that. So if we want to be part of that policy discussion, we need facts, which basically we don't have. The second area I wanted to raise is about digital markets. There is a lot to be said about it. We could have a 24-hour seminar about it. And that's an area where, to be fair, competition authorities have learned a lot from economists. So there can be no meaningful discussion in a competition authority about, say, digital markets without reference to two-sided or multi-sided markets, to ecosystem effects, and so on. So that's a tribute to, the economic footprint in that profession. But we need to keep up the pace, and it's interesting that Rod mentioned the bargaining code, because one of the biggest cases I had to deal with since I joined is precisely about that, precisely about the way Google has the way Google remunerates. Well, actually, initially did not remunerate at all press publishers in France for using their content. And so 2 years ago, the Autorité de la Concurrence instructed Google to start negotiating in good faith with publishers. And then 1 year ago, they found out that Google was not negotiating in good faith, and Google was fined 500 million euros, which is a lot. And we are about to decide on Google new commitments. And there are lots of questions coming in that discussion. Let me just pick two. One question we had to face was simply about the valuation of rights, of publishers' rights, particularly indirect rights, right? So suppose you go to Google, you want to Google the war in Ukraine, you want to know what's going on, you will find an article on the war in Ukraine in Google News, and then you will have an ad for, say, vodka, because that's how the algorithm of Google works, which is pretty dumb. So the publisher has a right to some money accruing to that ad being displayed on Google. How much is that worth? Very difficult to know. I mean, there is a little bit of thinking, but of course very biased thinking on both sides. And then where do you want to put your finger? Very difficult to say. And then if you click further, I mean, for how many clicks are you still talking about a right which is related to the initial search? Is that 2 clicks, 3 clicks, 4 clicks, 50 clicks? That's a discussion we had with Google, and it's really very difficult to inform it with facts. And so these are really empirical issues where we would need to know more. And another issue, which also Rod mentioned, is about the bargaining framework. So we've looked very closely into the Australian model. Let me call it a model. And we asked ourselves whether we could use it in France. And also there are legal aspects to that discussion, because we would presumably need a law, could presumably not be done as a decision by the competition authority, so that's the legal aspect of it. But there are also different market structures. So the news media market is less concentrated in France than it is in Australia. So that's a fact. But how does it impact? How does it change mechanism design? How should mechanism design account for different market structure? That's a theoretical question that we would have liked to know more about, to know if the Australian model would work well or not in France. So these are just examples, and there are many other examples in the digital field, particularly related to the relationship between competition policy and privacy, where we would need to know much more about those cases where competition policy and privacy are aligned, and those cases where competition policy and privacy are competing, or where you would have trade-offs, because that's what we see in real life, but we have no kind of general framework to reflect on it. And the last example I wanted to give is about sustainability, something we haven't mentioned yet. We feel as competition enforcer, we feel that we have a duty to be part of the global action to support sustainability and to fight against climate change. And there are two ways to do it. One way is rather proactive. That is, you want to carve space for companies to cooperate on sustainability enhancing practices without them being, investigated under competition law. So that's the positive side of it. And then you have the kind of defensive or repressive side of it, which is that you want to sanction firms that collude to not implement sustainability practices. And this also we've seen practically in our case law. But then what is the right metrics? And the fundamental issue here is that obviously you have an externality, and competition law is not fit to address externalities. Maybe law in general is not fit to address externalities, contrary to economics. And so if you consider two French firms that are agreeing on a standard that will be less harmful to biodiversity, say, that may help the environment in France, but that may raise prices. So that's fairly simple. You've got to balance both effects, and you've got to measure the effects and to decide whether the consumer has to be partly or fully or not at all compensated for the price impact. So that's a choice that has to be made. But suppose now that the two French companies are cooperating in China to produce car batteries that will be less harmful to the environment in China, but will raise prices for the French consumer. What do you do about that? As an economist, you would like to say, you will have this global externality, and there will be some spillover or spill back to France, and you want to be able to account for that, the part of the externalities that will benefit the French consumer. That's not really supported by the EU treaty, and what the EU treaty has to say about competition. So here you have instances where you need that kind of dialogue between economists and lawyers, and find some kind of middle ground to address the issue in a relevant way. And I stop here.
Thank you very much, Benoit. I'm aware that in a minute we got the Barcelona report, technology panel. I think you heard a lot of a research agenda which is open in front of us for the research community. The only area of disagreement I will have with Benoit is on the role that economists had with big tech platforms, that it was hugely helpful. If I have to think about the discussion in this literature on two-sided markets, which started 25 years ago, basically, as economists, we said there is a fundamental trade-off. These big tech platforms create markets where they didn't exist before, so it's a market expansion effect, but because of network effect, there is a tendency towards monopolization, and that's not good for consumers because it's going to be leading to a rent extraction. If I think about the policy discussion right now around Amazon, Google, and Facebook, it's exactly the same 25 years later. I don't call it progress. I put myself into that field because I was doing this kind of models, and we didn't have data from those companies to do any empirical analysis about it, so I don't call it a very useful progress. If a quarter of a century later we're still making the same arguments, we should actually speed up, I would imagine. But again, we hope that this RPN on competition policy will be useful in that respect. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you so much. A round of applause.